Joining me now is GB News presenter Darren Grimes. Darren, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has sacked Home Secretary Suella Braverman, a key member of his cabinet. This is in response to her public criticism of the police's handling of pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli marches. This comes as she went against Sunak's stance by publishing a piece in the Times last week, calling out the perception of two-tiered policing. It's much more than mere perception, Darren. We've seen the police be heavy-handed and almost Orwellian in arresting people for being upset by Palestinian flags in the streets. But you see these lawless protesters defacing property and chanting for genocide, and they're given a pass.
Absolutely. Rita, Suella Braverman was absolutely right in her assessment. I wonder if she has a crystal ball that she polished to perfection, because everything that she wrote about last week and warned about last week came true. Over the weekend, we saw the Machine Gun Corps War Memorial be desecrated by those holding and waving Palestinian flags, wrapping our monuments around with their Palestinian flag. And it just smacked of ingratitude for a nation that has given them so much as well. And I just ultimately, I really think that everything she's warned about, whether that be multiculturalism, whether that be two-tier policing, Rita, whether that be the fact that in Britain, law and order seems to be very much stacked against those who aren't politically correct. But if you are politically correct, well, the law doesn't apply to you. It just smacks, Rita, of the kind of things that don't represent British values. And I think that's what's under attack here. It's British values.
Well, in a twist that not many saw coming, former British PM David Cameron is set to make a shock return as Rishi Sunak's new Foreign Secretary. Can you tell me about that? And is that going to see the Tories be re-elected? Is that going to help Rishi out?
I mean, is Malcolm Turnbull going to come back and save the Liberal Party in Australia? I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. You know, is Joe Biden going to save the Democrats in the US? It's not looking likely. You know, David Cameron is a turd you can't flush, and it's a mighty posh turd at that, Rita. I think ultimately what Suella Braverman's sacking and David Cameron's return actually mark is actually, it's more than a cabinet reshuffle, right? This is a flagrant betrayal of the Brexit spirit, right?
Oh,
Britain is having a case of deja vu that we just don't want to have. It's like opening a time capsule, Rita, just to find in stale old biscuits when actually you wanted some gold or something like that. I just think in our vote for Brexit, we voted to reject the kind of Davos liberalism that David Cameron actually represents, right? That was roundly rejected again in 2016 and in 2019. 2016, of course, being the referendum. Now, the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson became a beacon of hope for those of us craving actual change. But now I'm afraid it's shamelessly backpedaled into a cosy liberalist elitist roots. And it's a slap in the face, frankly, to every voter who was disillusioned by hollow promises, the kind that Suella Braverman, dare I say, doesn't make. She actually speaks the truth. And Rita, she was sacked for speaking the truth. And they dared to believe in a robust national conservatism that has now, I'm afraid, been flatly rejected. And it's Braverman's ousting and Cameron's eerie resurgence, right, that actually are a glaring testament to the Tory leadership's abandonment of core principles, right? It's a staggering retreat back into bland patrician liberalism of the kind that the Brexit referendum so decisively rejected. And all of these things, I mean, he represents, Rita, a social liberalism that talked about hijabs, wearing a hijab covered in poppies, the kind of poppies that we've seen vilified on the streets of London this last weekend. How did that go? How did that multiculturalism go, Rita? Well, you tell me. You look on the streets at those wearing Hamas headbands on our streets today, and the fact that those war memorials that I spoke of were desecrated in such a blatant way, the disrespect, the sheer disrespect for those who fought and died so that these scumbags could be free to do that on the streets of London. And you tell me that multiculturalism has been an overwhelming success story.
Well, you mentioned the poppy sellers. Let's just have a look at some volunteers selling poppies on Remembrance Day weekend at London's Victoria Station who were swamped by a pro-Palestinian protest and had to move their stand. Let's have a quick look. You can see they have to keep moving as the protest grows and find a new spot. Police apparently later intervened as the volunteers who were raising funds for a veterans charity. I mean, Darren, it really just paints such a grim picture of how things are in the UK. I'd argue, Darren, it is far worse there than it is here in Australia or the US. Your so-called conservatives are the weakest of the lot. You were just talking about what's happening in the Tories. This is happening after more than a decade of Tory rule, where you saw Boris win that landslide, speaking like a conservative, but then even he governed like he was in the Labor Party, or some sort of mad green element of the Labor Party, and it hasn't got much better since.
Absolutely not. I mean, Britain is the canary in the coal mine, Rita, on this, I'm afraid to say. And this is a damning indictment of the state of Britain today. And, you know, we mentioned how bad it is elsewhere. I mean, what we saw outside of the Sydney Opera House, for example, with the blatant and open anti-Semitism. But I think you're right. What we see here is it's just so widespread in Britain. We've been accepting net migration figures of over 600,000 people net a year. That's, you know, thanks to idiots like Tony Blair and David Cameron. But you're totally right to say that 13 years the Conservatives have been in power. It's not just been David Cameron. We've accepted a load of people into the country who, frankly, don't share our values and would quite like us to be another country altogether. I mean, I'm reminded of a Policy Exchange, a think tank report back in 2016, a while ago now, so I imagine it's even worse, in which it found that 40% of British Muslims were said to be supportive of aspects of Sharia law in place of British law. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that that says something about the multiculturalism project that the political and media class have waxed lyrical about being an unmitigated success story that has actually been an unmitigated disaster for Britain and for the Western world. There was also a veteran, Rita, and it broke my heart. I felt really angry seeing this story. There was a veteran called Jim Henderson, Scottish bloke, and he described being kicked and punched in his back and side as he fought to get the money he'd been collecting for the poppy appeal out of Edinburgh's Waverley Station, a major train station in Britain. And eventually, the station staff had to step in and rescue him. That was during a Palestinian occupation. If you ask me, it's a damn disgrace. And now we found ourselves in the position where these people think they're above the law. And that's what Suella Braverman was trying to address. Those are the very issues that she was speaking of that are the cause of two-tier policing, where these people on our streets think that they are totally above the law. It simply does not apply to them. Now, of course, there are other videos that we've seen as well, that two-tier policing being totally evident in those. We had right-wing activists taken to the street, but I actually think a lot of those right-wing activists Rita, felt compelled to defend the cenotaph, which is perhaps, for those who don't know, the nation's, it's our symbol, it's where we go to pay our respects, our national monument of remembrance, where it's our focus for that day of remembrance. And that's all we wanted, Rita. We just wanted one weekend to remember those young boys and men who died so that Britain could be free, and the rest of Europe, it has to be said. And they couldn't even give us that, Rita. I don't think these protests should have been allowed to go ahead, frankly. I think it was an affront to everything we hold dear.
And yeah, those war monuments being vandalised on Remembrance Day, it really is a grim set of circumstances in the UK, and you do wonder what's going to happen next. Last question, given the state of the Tories, could Suella Braverman challenge for the leadership? Could there be a late change before the election?
Look, Suella Braverman speaks our language. When there was polled, her speech was polled last week, and 75% of Conservative voters, so they're the voters that Rishi Sunak needs to try and keep on side. It's not looking likely because the Labour Party are storming ahead 20 points in the polls. And Suella Braverman, 75% of the Conservative vote said, yep, I agree with what she's saying. She's bang on everything that she said. And I think that's important to remember. And right now, we're seeing letters of no confidence in Rishi Sunak's leadership going in to the 1922 committee, which is a committee that actually represents the backbench of the Conservative Party, the ruling party in Britain. And I think there is going to be real trouble. I think there are going to be splits within that party because Rishi Sunak has decided to prioritise Davos over Darlington. And I'm afraid to say that that is a complete betrayal of the 2019 coalition that Suella Braverman speaks the language of. So more power to her, Rita. She's one of us, and you should get her on one day because she absolutely is bloody brilliant, if you ask me.
Well, I hope she challenges and the electorate actually has a choice at the electorate, and they're not just picking between Labor and Labor Light. Darren Grimes, thank you so much for your time today.